The Phantom Train of Hollow Ridge. Hollow Ridge was a quiet, forgotten town nestled deep in the mountains, where the only thing more eerie than the silence was the abandoned railway that cut through it. The tracks hadn't been used in over 50 years, ever since a tragic accident had claimed the lives of more than 100 passengers. The railway company had shut it down, but the memory of the disaster lingered, casting a shadow over the town. Most people in Hollow Ridge avoided the tracks, especially at night. There were rumors, stories passed down from generation to generation about a ghost train that still roared through the town on the anniversary of the crash. People said that if you were unlucky enough to hear its whistle, you would be doomed to suffer the same fate as the lost souls aboard. For decades, no one had dared to find out if the stories were true. That is, until a group of thrill-seeking friends from out of town decided to put the legend to the test. On the eve of the 50th anniversary of the crash, Emily, Marcus, Jenna, and Dave made their way to the old tracks. Armed with nothing but flashlights and their phones, they were determined to catch the ghost train on camera and prove the legend to be nothing more than a myth. As they reached the railway, the night grew unnaturally cold, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring the path ahead. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The group walked along the tracks, laughing nervously, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over them. They reached the spot where the crash was said to have happened. A twisted, overgrown stretch of track that had long been abandoned to nature. The rusted rails lay crooked, swallowed by weeds and dirt. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. "This is it," Marcus said, checking his phone. "Right here. This is where the train went off the tracks." Emily shivered, not from the cold, but from the oppressive weight of the place. It felt wrong, as though the earth itself was soaked with the sorrow of those who had died. She glanced around, suddenly unsure of their plan. "Maybe we should go," she whispered, but her friends were already setting up their phones, eager to catch something, anything, on camera. Then, without warning, the distant sound of a whistle pierced the night. The group froze. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the long, mournful wail of a train. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet, the vibrations growing stronger as the sound drew nearer. "That's impossible," Dave muttered, his voice trembling. "There's no train on this track anymore." But the whistle grew louder, and now they could hear the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, the heavy, thundering chug of an engine coming closer. Emily's heart raced. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. Through the thick fog, a light appeared down the track, a single blinding beam cutting through the darkness. It grew larger, bearing down on them, but there was no train in sight. Just the light, rushing forward, and the sound of the engine roaring like a beast from the underworld. The ground shook violently, and the friends stumbled backward, watching in terror as the ghostly train barreled toward them. They could see it now, a massive, old-fashioned steam engine, its body flickering in and out of existence, as though it were trapped between two worlds. Its windows glowed with a pale, sickly light, and behind them, shadowy figures stood, staring out with hollow eyes. Screams filled the air, not from the group, but from the train itself. The voices of the doomed passengers echoed in the night, crying out for help that would never come. Emily tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. The train was too close, its whistle deafening, the headlights blinding. She could feel the cold, suffocating air of the train as it passed, like a phantom wind cutting through her. And then, Just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The sound of the engine faded, the ground stopped trembling, and the eerie silence returned. The group stood there panting, their faces pale and their hearts pounding in their chests. They were alive, but something had changed. The air was thick with dread, and when they looked at each other, they saw fear reflected in each other's eyes. What just happened? Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. But before anyone could answer, Marcus screamed. They turned to see him staring down the tracks, his face frozen in horror. Emily followed his gaze and gasped. There, in the fog, was a figure, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes black as coal. She stood on the tracks, watching them. As they stared in disbelief, the woman took a step toward them, her movements slow and deliberate. Then another step, and another. Emily turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear her friends screaming behind her, but she didn't dare look back. They fled the tracks and didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the town. When they finally looked back, the figure was gone. No one ever spoke of the incident again. The group parted ways, and none of them returned to Hollow Ridge. But the memory of the phantom train and the woman who followed them from the wreckage haunted them for the rest of their lives. And every year, on the anniversary of the crash, the sound of a distant whistle can still be heard, echoing through the mountains of Hollow Ridge. Years had passed since that night, but Emily could never shake the memory of the ghost train. She tried to move on, burying the terror deep in her mind, but it had a way of resurfacing, clawing its way back into her thoughts. Every now and then she would wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, as if she could hear the faint echo of that cursed whistle in the distance. It had been a decade since she had last seen her friends. The incident had fractured their bond. No one wanted to relive that night or discuss what really happened. But now, all these years later, Emily received a message from Jenna that sent a chill down her spine. "We need to talk. I've been hearing it again, the whistle. Meet me at the old diner in Hollow Ridge. I think it's back for us." Emily sat staring at the message, her fingers trembling over her phone. The rational part of her screamed to ignore it, to stay away from Hollow Ridge. But another part of her, an unsettled part, knew Jenna was right. The train wasn't finished with them. Reluctantly, Emily packed a small bag, got in her car, and drove through the winding mountain roads back to Hollow Ridge. The town was just as desolate and eerie as she remembered, the shadows of the trees long and dark as the sun began to set. When she arrived at the diner, Jenna was already waiting at a corner booth, looking pale and worn, as if she hadn't slept in days. "You came," Jenna whispered, her eyes hollow with fear. Emily nodded, sitting across from her old friend. "Tell me what's happening." Jenna leaned in, lowering her voice. "It's been happening for the last few months. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it's real, Emily. I hear it at night, the whistle, and it's not just me. Marcus called me last week, terrified. He's been hearing it too. Dave, well, I don't know where Dave is. He disappeared a few weeks ago. No one's seen him since." Emily's blood ran cold. "Do you think it's the train?" Jenna nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think we've been marked. That night on the tracks, whatever we saw, it didn't just disappear. It's coming back for us." Emily shook her head, trying to steady her breathing. "What do we do?" "I've been doing some research," Jenna said, pulling out a crumpled old notebook. "There's something called the Train of the Lost. It's an urban legend that's older than Hollow Ridge itself. The train is cursed, doomed to ride forever, collecting souls of those it touches. But there's a way to break the curse. Emily leaned in. How? We have to go back, Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to face it again. The only way to stop it from taking us is to confront it. Emily's heart sank. Every instinct told her that going back to the tracks was a terrible idea. But if Jenna was right, if this thing really was coming for them, they didn't have a choice. The two women left the diner, the sinking feeling in their stomachs growing as they made their way to the old railway once again. The night was darker than before, the fog thicker, rolling in like a shroud over the landscape. The temperature dropped sharply, the cold biting at their skin as they approached the same stretch of track where it had all begun. They stood in silence, the air heavy with dread. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then, just as it had before, the distant whistle pierced the night. Emily's blood ran cold. It's starting. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the faint rumble of the ghostly train growing louder with each passing second. The beam of the headlight appeared through the fog, rushing toward them with terrifying speed. We have to stand our ground, Jenna shouted over the rising roar. Don't run. But Emily's body screamed at her to flee. The train barreled toward them, a monstrous force of flickering light and shadow. The passengers' ghostly faces pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes filled with desperation and sorrow. The screeching of the wheels against the rusted tracks was deafening, and the wind that followed the train felt like 1,000 icy hands pulling at their souls. The whistle blared, and the train was almost upon them when something strange happened. Instead of passing through them like it had before, the train screeched to a halt, just inches away. The doors of the train hissed open, revealing nothing but a black void inside. The shadows of the passengers stared out at them, their voices whispering in the wind. "Come aboard," they hissed, their words stretching into the darkness. Emily and Jenna stood frozen, their legs like lead. The cold seeped into their bones as the spectral figures stepped off the train, surrounding them in a circle. The figures' eyes glowed faintly, as if they were trapped souls yearning for release. One of the figures stepped forward, its face a blur of shadow and light, and spoke in a low, haunting voice. "You took something from us that night," it said. "Now you must give it back." Emily's heart raced. "What do you want from us?" The figure pointed to the tracks beneath their feet. "The train runs on blood and memory. One of you must stay, or the train will come for you both." Panic surged through Emily's chest. Stay? What did it mean? Jenna grabbed her arm, her face white with terror. We can't do this." The figures grew closer, their cold, clammy hands reaching for them. Emily realized, in that terrible moment, that one of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. If they didn't, the train would continue to haunt them, perhaps even take more people with it. "Jenna," Emily whispered, her throat tight. "We have to choose." The whistle screamed once more, louder, more impatient. The ground trembled as the ghostly passengers gathered around the open doors, their eyes filled with anguish. Jenna's breath came in shallow gasps. She shook her head, tears spilling down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Before Emily could react, Jenna broke free from her grip and stepped toward the train. The figures parted, and she turned to Emily with a sad smile. "It has to be me." "No, Jenna," Emily screamed, reaching out, but it was too late. Jenna stepped onto the train, and the doors slammed shut behind her. The whistle screamed, and with a deafening roar, the train began to move again, fading into the fog as quickly as it had come. Emily fell to her knees, sobbing as the sound of the train disappeared into the night. She was alone, but as the fog lifted and the first light of dawn broke through the trees, she knew the curse had been broken. The train was gone, and so was Jenna, but the memory of that night would haunt her forever. The days that followed Jenna's sacrifice were a blur for Emily. Her mind struggled to comprehend what had happened. She had survived, but the cost was unbearable. She replayed Jenna's final moments over and over in her head, haunted by the image of her friend stepping onto that ghostly train. Emily tried to return to her normal life, but nothing felt the same. The town of Hollow Ridge, once a place she had vowed never to return to, now felt like a prison. Every corner of the town reminded her of the night she had lost Jenna, and of the curse that had nearly claimed them both. She moved to the city, hoping the noise and chaos would drown out the memories. For a while, it worked. The phantom whistle was a distant nightmare, and the city lights replaced the darkness of the tracks. But the silence followed her. One evening, as Emily sat alone in her apartment, she heard it, the unmistakable distant whistle of the ghost train. Her heart froze. She hadn't heard the sound since the night on the tracks, and she had convinced herself it was over. But now, in the safety of her home, the low, mournful cry of the whistle echoed through the walls. She ran to the window, heart pounding, and looked out at the bustling street below. There were no tracks, no train station, just the usual hum of city life. But the sound grew louder, and with it, the faint, impossible tremor beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat as the lights in her apartment flickered. No, Emily whispered to herself, backing away from the window. It's over. It has to be. But the whistle blared again, louder this time, and she could feel it, the same cold, suffocating presence she had felt on the tracks that night. It was coming for her. Suddenly her phone buzzed on the table. Startled, she grabbed it and looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. It's not over. We're still here. We always will be. Emily's hand shook as she read the message. She dropped the phone and stumbled back, her heart racing. The room felt colder, the lights dimmer. And then she heard a faint knock at the door. Her mind screamed at her not to answer, but her body moved on instinct. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. With a deep breath, she pulled the door open. No one was there. But as she stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Across the hallway, in the shadows near the stairwell, stood a figure, a young woman in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes black as coal. It was Jenna. No, Emily whispered, stepping back in horror. You're gone. You sacrificed yourself. Jenna took a step toward her, her movements slow and unnatural, as if her body no longer obeyed the rules of the living. I thought it would end when I got on the train, Jenna said, her voice hollow, distant. But it didn't. I'm still here, Emily. We're all still here. Emily's heart raced. What do you mean? Jenna's eyes darkened, her face twisting with sorrow. The train didn't take me to the afterlife. It's not a passage to anywhere. It's a prison. We're trapped. Me, the passengers, all of us. The train keeps us, and now it wants you too. No, Emily shook her head, stepping back into her apartment. No, I won't go with you. Jenna's figure flickered like a broken television signal, and she reached out, her voice desperate. Please, Emily, help me. I thought I was saving you, but I was wrong. The train wants more than just passengers. It wants the ones left behind, too. Emily's chest tightened as she realized the horrible truth. The train wasn't just a haunting, it was a curse. And Jenna, by sacrificing herself, had become part of it. Now it was coming for her. The whistle blared again, louder this time, so loud it rattled the walls. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as the tremors beneath her feet grew stronger. The train was near. Jenna's figure flickered again, her ghostly form dissolving into the shadows. "It's coming, Emily. You can't run." The ground shook violently as the sound of wheels clattering on tracks filled the room. The walls of the apartment seemed to warp, bending around her as if the train was pulling her into its world. Emily stumbled backward, her head spinning, the cold presence of the train suffocating her. "Fight it!" Jenna's voice echoed in the dark, though her figure had vanished. "You have to stop it!" Emily's mind raced. How could she stop it? The train was a force beyond the living, beyond anything she understood. But then a memory surfaced, something Jenna had said that night on the tracks. The train runs on blood and memory. Emily's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The train was powered by the lives it had taken, by the fear and memories of those it had claimed. But if it could be fueled, maybe it could be starved. She had to let go. She had to break the hold the train had on her mind and soul. Summoning all her strength, Emily closed her eyes and focused on the memories that tied her to the train. The fear, the loss of Jenna, the terror of that night. She pictured them clearly, then willed herself to release them. Slowly, she felt the weight lift from her chest, the suffocating cold beginning to fade. The whistle blared one final time, but it was weaker now, distant, fading into the background like a bad dream. When Emily opened her eyes, the apartment was still. The lights flickered back on, and the tremors stopped. She stood there trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the train was gone. The curse had lifted. Exhausted, Emily sank to the floor, her body shaking with relief. Jenna's ghostly presence no longer haunted the room, and the oppressive feeling had vanished. It was over, for now. But deep down, Emily knew the train was still out there, riding the tracks of the forgotten places, searching for new souls to claim. And someday, it might come again.